And now on to the New England colonies. Just a quick overview, wanted to go through this really fast. So we've covered like Spain, France, we've covered the Dutch a little bit, and then the English, we've got all of these different colonies. So we've covered Chesapeake, Virginia, and Maryland, but feel free to make note of these other areas because right here today we're going to look at New England, and these are the different colonies within the New England colonies altogether. We're going to jump back to the Dutch in a second, but not quite yet. And then there's going to be even more English colonies, such as the southern colonies and the middle colonies that we'll get into on a later PowerPoint. But feel free to like take a screenshot of this or something if you want to, just because it's great for organization purposes. So, the New England colonies. The thing is, the first try in this area, that this is a map that's very zoomed in on this, was actually in 1607, and they tried first at Plymouth, but they actually abandoned it fairly quickly, partly because of a really harsh winter, and because they, surprise, surprise, alienated the local Native American populations. However, between 1616 and 1618, basically an epidemic is going to sweep through the coastal area of New England, and it kills up to 90% of the Indians living in this region. And so the next time the English are going to try to set up a colony in this region, the Native Americans are struggling to survive and set up themselves again. And so that kind of changes the scenario. So in 1620, we are going to see Plymouth colony is initially set up. This is, yes, a picture of Plymouth Rock. The way they found so-called Plymouth Rock is they had someone go in and basically recreate their journey, and they're like, we're pretty sure that that rock is Plymouth Rock. So we're not 100% sure if this actually is Plymouth Rock. It used to not be surrounded, and the whole thing is a lot of people would go up to it and chip off little pieces as souvenirs, so it's a lot smaller than it used to be, but it's really questionable if it ever was exactly Plymouth Rock, so to speak. So the thing is, in 1620, we're going to see the Puritans are going to manage to set up Plymouth colony. The Puritans were a group of Protestants. Keep in mind, Protestants are Christians. And so basically the Puritans rejected the Book of Common Prayer, and this is what regulates Anglican worship, Anglican being the Church of England. The Puritans were more about like, we need to pray from our heart and, you know, preach the Bible. They objected to the like rich vestments and everything that were worn by the Anglican like priests, so to speak. And they also were against any kind of church organization above, you know, like the level of an individual congregation where you have like a pastor and your community. So they basically were against, you know, having bishops, archbishops, that kind of hierarchy. They also believed in an all-powerful God that at the moment of creation determined which humans would be saved and which ones would be damned. So the thing is, this is kind of undermining the idea of hierarchy within society. And so you can see that would be problematic for a lot of rulers, such as Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth, during her time ruling England, her and the rulers that follow her basically sought to silence the Puritans for not completely agreeing with her and agreeing with the whole Church of England and everything. And so a lot of Puritans are going to face a lot of they're going to face a lot of persecution, basically. And so basically we're going to have two different groups of Puritans. One are the separatists and the other group are the non-separatists. I'm going to talk about the separatists here. The separatists were basically Puritans who were convinced the Church of England would never change. So rather than trying to convince the Church of England to change, they just left to form their own congregations. Now, one group of separatists, I should mention, moved to Holland originally, but then they were really concerned about like Dutch city life might tempt their children, and so they would go on to gain the backing of the Plymouth Company and basically move to America and thus set up the Plymouth colony. They were actually joined by other separatists and non-separatists to help this colony start. The thing is, when they landed in America, or in the Americas, they landed about 200 miles north of the original charter that they had planned on. And so at this point, some of the people on the boats basically were saying, hey, we're no longer bound to follow like the separatist leaders of this because we're no longer within the chartered boundaries. And thus came about the drafting of the Mayflower Compact. So this is all about democracy here, and we're going to see these effects all the way to today. This document basically bound all the signers to abide by the decision of the majority. So this is majority rule, a big part of democracy that we still see through to today. I should note this, the cynic in me, it's easy to make this promise of, majority rule if you know you are the one that makes up the majority. So kind of keep that in mind. Once again, though, even at this point, these colonists, who were known as the Pilgrims, are going to be met with starvation and disease in that first winter, and about half of them will die. But they would then go on to make the Treaty of Alliance in 1621 with the local Native Americans. When the Native Americans signed this treaty, the natives were signing it thinking that they were equal to the colonists. However, the Pilgrims thought that the natives were submitting themselves to the superior authority of King James of England. You do have individuals, though, like Squanto, that would offer advice to both sides and mediate until he died in 1622. And because of this alliance, we do see that the colonists will flourish because the Native Americans would teach them how to plant corn. They would trade it for like furs to ship back. This is when you get the whole like mythos of the first Thanksgiving and everything. But keep in mind, none of this would have happened if it hadn't been for the whole, epidemic that had swept away 90% of the native population before all of this. There are also other colonies that were set up pretty soon afterwards. For instance, we get like the Massachusetts colony as well as its offshoots. The thing is, the Massachusetts colony, which is initially going to be founding of Boston as well as 6 adjacent towns, is made in 1623 when they got a royal charter for a joint stock enterprise to set up a colony just north of Plymouth. This is going to be set up by non-separatists. The thing is, non-separatist Puritans were opposed to, the Church of England, the Rich Westminster, everything like that. But they wanted, rather than to separate themselves from the Church of England, they wanted to be like the example to the Church of England, to reform the Church of England or the Anglican Church. Part of this came from England was having a lot of economic problems during this time period. There were crop failures. There was a depression in the wool industry, actually. And Puritans saw this as, this is a sign of God punishing us for, not worshiping him the correct way. And also you have to keep in mind, 1625, that's when King Charles I is on the throne. Remember, he's the one that's opposing a lot of the Puritans. He actually wanted to recall certain Catholic practices. Remember, he's the one that goes and gets beheaded and everything. And so it's very much they wanted to reform the Church of England. And this is how they were going to do it, being the example over in the Massachusetts colony. The thing is, this colony in Boston, their desire for peace and purity was so intense that it actually bred intolerance. Everyone was scrutinizing each other constantly, making sure, are you peaceful enough? Are you prayer enough? Are you praying enough? And so on and so forth. And so this actually ends up creating a very stable society. And assisting in that stability, we're going to see that they're going to set up a representative government. Hey, we've seen that before today. They're going to have 2 houses, once again, today as well, where we'd have freedmen elect representatives in the lower house, and then there's 18 members to the upper house. Now, from here, we're going to get the Connecticut Valley, which will eventually form into the Connecticut colony. The whole thing is, some background here is we get a lot of settlers moving into the Massachusetts Bay Colony from like 1630 through 42-ish, things like that, and they're expanding out. And so people start moving south into the Connecticut Valley, but tensions with the Native Americans are going to grow because of this. And then in 1637, you get the Pequot War. Background on this. The Pequot Native Americans basically had a partnership with the Dutch colonists in this area to monopolize trade with for like European goods for all the other tribes. But then the Dutch in 1633 had started inviting like rivals of the Pequot to trade with them as well. So the Pequot have basically lost these like special trading rights. And then on top of that, they're going to suffer a smallpox epidemic that basically leads them to approach the Massachusetts Bay Colony, hoping to gain an ally against the Dutch. The problem is when they talk to the English colonists at Massachusetts, the English colonists wanted the Indians to submit to English authority, and the Pequots did not want to do that, and so they turned on them as well. This was a huge mistake because the English then would go on to ally themselves with rivals of the Pequots and even enemies of the Pequots, and they would go on to do things like surround the Pequots' village, set it ablaze, shoot anyone who tried to escape, and somewhere between like 300 and 700 Pequot Native Americans died in this warfare. In fact, the Indian allies to the English were appalled by this. They protested that English warfare is just like too furious. It slays too many. A lot of times people like to think of Native Americans as like not being violent or anything. It's more complicated than that. Generally speaking, and keep in mind there are exceptions to this, generally speaking, Native Americans could be very violent with their warfare, but a lot of times they didn't necessarily kill each other outright. A lot of times they'd, capture people, torture them within an inch of their life, heal them back, do it multiple times, enslave them, but they tried to avoid killing outright, and especially killing hundreds and hundreds of people, whereas the English, as you can see here, had no qualms with that. Basically, the survivors, though, of the Pequot War are going to flee, or they're going to be sold into slavery, and soon enough there are more settlers in Connecticut, and they would actually declare themselves to be their own separate colony. Also, I should mention in 1639, Connecticut's colony would adopt the Fundamental Orders, which was a government that very much was similar to Massachusetts. From there, we have to get to this last group colony, which is Rhode Island. Rhode Island is going to be established by Roger Williams. Roger Williams was a separatist, so he's a Puritan separatist. The thing is, remember, Massachusetts was non-separatist, and so Roger Williams was frustrated with the Massachusetts colony because he felt like that they needed to reject the Church of England, and as long as they didn't reject it, that they were sharing in the Church of England's corruption. And so he also, though, took it like a step further than that. Roger Williams believed in things like, he argued for the separation of church and state. Hey, there's something that we see all the way to today. And he insisted actually that the King of England had no right to grant Indian lands to English settlers. This could be considered treason, though, at this time. The thing is, Roger Williams, though, was extremely likable, very charismatic guy. Despite this, what could be considered treason, he was banished, though. However, before he could be shipped back to England, he managed to escape, and then he would go on to purchase land from the Nargasseret Indians and establish the village of Providence in 1636, thus making the Rhode Island colony. Once again, this is just a map, so you can see we've now covered the Chesapeake colonies. Remember, that was Virginia and Maryland. And then up in this yellow region, this is what we just covered, is the New England colonies. So just kind of keep this map in mind.